As the last colors of sunset faded from the sky, casting the world into a deep blue twilight, Rain felt her heartbeat quicken. Her cousins, Leo, Aiden, and Maggie, stood beside her, huddled close on the porch of their grandparents' cabin. The air was rich with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the chirping crickets and the occasional rustling of branches in the evening breeze. They had come up with a plan, one they knew was risky. But their curiosity about the woods, about the world that seemed to come alive after dark, had taken hold. Despite their grandparents' frequent warnings, they were set on sneaking out for a nighttime adventure, a secret quest into the depths of the forest. In the city where Rain lived, night was filled with lights and the distant hum of traffic. Here, darkness felt real and powerful, as though it could pull you right into its depths if you weren't careful. But the idea thrilled her. "Are we really doing this?" Rain whispered, glancing at her cousins. The faintest hint of doubt flickered within her, but it was quickly chased away by her excitement. Leo grinned, his face mischievous in the dim light. "Of course. We'll be back before sunrise, and they'll never know," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. Rain could tell he was putting on a brave face. "Are you sure?" asked Maggie, who at 9 was the youngest. She looked up at them, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Aiden, usually the quietest, gave a nod, his expression resolute. "We'll stick together," he said. "Just stay close, and remember, it's just the woods. Nothing out there can hurt us, probably." The four of them waited until the house was quiet, the adults settled in for the night, before they silently gathered their supplies. A small flashlight, a worn map, a battered compass their grandfather had given them years ago, and a little tent they'd begged to use for the special occasion of their night out. The woods seemed to welcome them with a chilly embrace as they slipped away from the cabin and made their way down the familiar trails. The deeper they went, the more the forest changed. What was familiar by day became strange and shadowed in the moonlight, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and rocks casting ominous silhouettes. Every snap of a twig made them jump, but they laughed it off, driven by a blend of nerves and excitement. After about 20 minutes, they found the small clearing they'd often played in, next to the creek that ran through the trees. They decided it was the perfect place to set up camp. "All right, let's get the tent up before we lose all our light," Leo said, setting down his pack and pulling out the small tent. It took them a little while to get it upright, and they laughed as they struggled with the stubborn poles, hands fumbling in the dark. When they finally had it up, they sat around a small flashlight, letting its soft glow cut through the shadows. "So," Leo began, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Who's got a good scary story?" Rain glanced at her cousins, her heart thumping with a mix of excitement and unease. She knew her grandparents' tales well, and she had heard about the dangers that supposedly lurked in the woods at night. But it was only now, sitting under the vastness of the darkened sky, that the stories began to feel real. Yet, she found herself compelled to share. "There's one story Grandma told me," Rain began, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's about a skinwalker." The mention of the word made the group go still. Skinwalkers were a forbidden topic in their grandparents' house, spoken of only in hushed voices, never directly addressed. Grandma had warned them never to speak of it at night, especially in the woods. But here, in the thrill of their secret quest, Rain ignored the tingling unease in her spine. "They're witches, people who can turn into animals to trick others," she explained. "They use dark magic, becoming twisted and deformed. And they can call your name, trying to lure you deeper into the woods." Maggie's eyes went wide, and she hugged her knees to her chest. "What do they look like?" she whispered, almost as if she regretted asking the question. "Well," Rain said, leaning in, "they say they look like animals, but, wrong. Their bodies are twisted and broken. Sometimes, they wear the face of a human, stretched over an animal skull." Aiden gave a shiver, though he tried to play it off with a chuckle. "You're trying to scare us." "That's the point," Leo said, though he looked over his shoulder, as if expecting to see something lurking beyond the tree line. Rain felt a thrill at the reaction her story had drawn, but a part of her was beginning to regret speaking the name. Just then, the wind picked up, rattling the leaves around them. The flashlight flickered. "Maybe we should stop," Maggie whispered. Her fingers dug into Rain's arm. "Come on, Maggie, it's just a story," Leo said, though his voice was softer now. Rain was about to reassure her cousin when a low rustling sound echoed from the trees. She tensed, her heartbeat quickening. The sound was faint at first, like someone slowly dragging their feet through the underbrush. Then it stopped, and silence settled over them like a heavy blanket. Did you hear that?" Rain whispered, her voice barely audible. Her cousins nodded, all of them straining to listen. And then it came again, a soft, shuffling noise, accompanied by a faint, wheezing breath. Rain felt a chill crawl up her spine. She didn't dare move, barely even breathe as the sound grew closer. A shadow passed just beyond the circle of their flashlight, the barest glimpse of something moving between the trees. Maggie clutched Rain's hand, her grip trembling. "What is that?" she mouthed, her eyes wide with terror. Leo reached for the flashlight, his hands shaking as he slowly unzipped a small part of the tent flap. They crowded around, their breaths shallow, peering out into the night. The flashlight's beam cut through the shadows, casting a weak circle of light onto the trees. For a moment, there was nothing. Just darkness and the whisper of the wind. And then, it appeared. A figure moved into the edge of the light, grotesque and distorted. It had the body of a coyote, but its limbs were twisted, far too long, with patches of fur missing. Its skin was pulled taut over bones that jutted out at odd angles, giving it a skeletal appearance. And its face, the face was the worst. It looked as though someone had stretched the flesh of a human face over a coyote's skull, its eyes sunken and glowing faintly, its mouth open in a silent scream. Rain's heart stopped, her mind numb with terror. She wanted to look away, to shut her eyes and pretend this was all a nightmare, but she couldn't move. None of them could. The creature's breathing was harsh and ragged, filling the air with the scent of decay and something sulphurous. It circled their tent, moving in a jerky, unnatural way, as though its limbs didn't quite know how to function. And then it spoke. "Help me," it rasped, its voice distorted and hollow, like an echo from the bottom of a well. The words were wrong, stretched and twisted, trying to mimic a human voice but failing in the most terrifying way. Maggie whimpered, pressing her face into Rain's shoulder, but Rain could only sit there, frozen, listening to the creature's haunting plea. "Please, help me." The words were barely more than a whisper, yet they sliced through the silence with a sharpness that made her blood run cold. She knew, deep down, that this thing was not human. That it was something darker, something their grandparents had warned them about, something they had foolishly ignored. "Don't respond," Leo mouthed, his eyes wide with terror. They huddled together, trying to stay as silent as possible, hoping the creature would go away. The creature pressed against the tent fabric, its shadow looming over them, close enough that Rain could make out the shape of its distorted limbs and the awful, human-like face. It stayed there for a moment, breathing heavily, its scent overwhelming. And then, slowly, it began to move away, its shuffling steps fading into the darkness. The group sat in stunned silence, hardly daring to breathe, as the forest returned to its natural sounds. But none of them felt safe. They sat there until dawn, too afraid to move, too terrified to sleep. And when the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, they scrambled out of the tent, packing up as quickly as possible and leaving without a second glance back. The walk back felt longer than before, each step heavy with the weight of what they had seen. When they emerged from the forest, their grandparents were waiting on the porch, arms crossed, faces etched with worry. Their grandmother's eyes softened, but her voice was stern. "Where have you been?" Leo looked down, ashamed. We went camping," he mumbled, unable to meet her gaze. Grandpa's expression darkened. We told you not to go out at night. Rain could no longer hold back her fear. We saw something, she said, her voice trembling.